All right, guys, welcome to this week's digital imaging class. The first thing I want to mention is that we need to have our bios filled out by tonight. So if you haven't already, head over to the discussion board inside of Canvas and make sure to answer these simple questions. I'd love to see an image or a link to some art that you like. This is just something I think helps tailor the class to your guys' interests. And I'm going to be seeing some of you for the next couple years, so the sooner I can get to know you guys, the better. Moving on, what can you do with Photoshop? Well, we've already hopped in and done an assignment, and I want to talk about that assignment for just a second, because I know that more than a few of you have run into some snags and maybe even gotten a little frustrated with the very first assignment. And I just want to point out that that is totally normal. If you've never used Photoshop before, it can be daunting. There's a lot of steps to follow, and there's a lot of things you just need to be familiar with. So all I'm asking in this second week of the class is fight the urge to get frustrated. As we go along with this, it's gonna get easier. You're gonna get more familiar with all of the important things in Photoshop. So, like I said, for those of you who maybe felt like this week was a little bit of an uphill battle, stick with it. Trust me when I say this will get easier. And if you do run into a specific problem, take a note of where the problem was, and you're welcome to send me a screenshot. Anything you can do to help me help you, meaning things like screenshots, which if you're on a Mac computer, you can hold down Shift Command 4, and that'll give you a little crosshair that you can then drag out to take a screenshot. I'll show you right now. If I hit Shift Command 4, notice I get this little crosshair, and if I click and drag it out, we just took that screenshot right there, which I did not mean to bring into my PowerPoint, but there it is. Moving forward, what can you do with Photoshop? Well, Photoshop is where editors crop photos, adjust photo composition, correct lighting, make any subject imaginable look its absolute best. It's also where skilled artists can create collages and photo composites, layer images together, and craft original images out of photo files. So as I mentioned in the previous video, I have a little company called Motion Creative Media. If you go to YouTube and you search Motion Creative Media, you will find a page with some additional tutorials. As I mentioned last week, every assignment that has a tutorial will have that tutorial embedded in the assignment, so you won't have to go searching for them. This is just a quick example of a website that I built for my company. Now, every one of these photos went through Photoshop before being put into this website. So again, if you want to get a portfolio going or start building a business, obviously Photoshop is going to be important. Here's just a quick example of some compositing that I've done in Photoshop. As you can see on the left, we have some images, and on the right, we have them all composited together. Moving on, here's just some additional examples of work I've done in Photoshop. Moving on, this is just a quick example of Photoshop's automatic colorizing abilities. How you can take black and white images and colorize them. We'll learn how to do that. Here's an example of one of the assignments we'll be doing in this class. If you look in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see a pair of tennis shoes. Now we're going to learn how to clip out and white balance tennis shoes, or any product for that matter. And then we're going to learn how to put it in an advertisement. And with that done, now I want to talk about two programs, one of which you've probably heard of, but might not know that much about. And so Adobe has a piece of software called Illustrator. And understand, I'm explaining this because I'm going to go somewhere with this. It's not just about explaining Adobe software. But Illustrator and Photoshop are two pieces of software that are for image editing. And the difference is important to understand because a lot of what we can do in Adobe Illustrator, we can now do right inside of Photoshop. To understand the difference between these apps, well, one works in vectors and one works in pixels. And we'll explain what that means. Different apps, different images. Adobe Creative Cloud gives graphics artists and photographers the creation and editing tools they need to realize their visions. This includes both graphic design software to make new work and the editing tools to make content like photos and videos look their best. Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator both work with images, but they're very different applications. The main difference between Photoshop and Illustrator are the types of files that each program works with, whether you're editing graphics or photos. So here is an example of artwork created using Adobe Illustrator. Illustrator is a graphic design application. Graphic designers use Illustrator to create vector graphics, and that, students, is why I am bringing this up. The term vector. Okay, that's something that we're going to hear a lot in this class. It's something you're going to hear a lot in your graphic design journey. So, vector images and graphics are made of points, lines, shapes, and curves. And they're based off of mathematical formulas rather than a set amount of pixels. And therefore, they can be scaled up or scaled down while maintaining image quality. So vector artwork can fit different sizes, larger or smaller, without losing any detail. And that is the main difference. The reason you use vector lines and things like that is so that you can scale your work up and scale it down. If you need to put it on a billboard, you can stretch it out without any loss of quality. If you need to put it on the back of a pen, you can scale it down without losing quality. But the one thing that you lose out on when you switch to complete vector images is the use of photographs. Okay, as you may know, photographs have a limited number of pixels. And pixels is just short for picture element. It's the little dots that make up a photograph. And so, if we move on to the next slide here, you'll see that when you use Photoshop, Photoshop is the industry standard photo editing. And it's the go-to application for everything from small retouching changes to mind-bending photo art. Photoshop is where editors can crop, adjust photo compositions, correct lighting, and make any subject imaginable look its absolute best. It's also where skilled artists can create collages and photo composites, layer images together, and craft original images out of different photo files. But the point is this: if I shoot a photograph on my camera, and let's say it's roughly 4,000 pixels wide by 2,000 pixels tall, I can't just basically take that image and make it 8,000 pixels wide and 4,000 pixels tall, because there's a limited number of pixels. And if I stretch the image larger than its original size, I'm going to lose quality. You're going to start to see those small little pixels that are basically invisible start to get bigger and become noticeable squares. I'm sure you've all seen this before plenty of times. If I pull up a Photoshop real quick here, you can see I have an image of a bug that I shot out in my backyard. And right now, if we look in the lower left-hand corner, you can see that this image has 8,256 pixels by 5,004. It also has a resolution of 300 pixels per inch. That means that every inch has 300 pixels, which is what we call high resolution, as opposed to something on the internet that would only have 72 pixels per inch. You can also see that this is currently scaled to 33%. So if I shrink it down here, basically what that means is I can keep hitting Command plus to zoom in. And there we go. We're now looking at this image at 100%. So this is essentially as big as you would ever ideally want to have this image. If I continue to zoom in, and let's bump it up to, now we're at 1600, which is a ridiculous amount of zoom. And you can see that now we can actually see the little grid and each little dot of color. Those are pixels. And again, this is a high resolution image, so even when I zoom in on it, it still looks pretty detailed. But again, once you zoom past 100%, that's when you start to see the loss of quality. As you can see, all my detail starts to get softer. It just doesn't look good anymore. So this is the limitation of pixel-based images. If I go to this image right here, which is probably a little thumbnail, but the point is, if I took this image and I zoomed way in, you would start to see it fall apart. And when I say that fall apart, what I mean is you start to see these lines get jagged. You start to see what we call artifacting, and that's these little soft sort of outlines around our subject here. And that is an example of basically pushing a JPEG too far. Let's see if I can find this, scale it back down. So understanding the size of your JPEG and not, or any photograph for that matter, and not extending it past its full size is a really important way to maintain quality in your work. All right, moving on. So again, I just want to point out, these are often referred to as raster images. You may sometimes be asked in Photoshop if you want to rasterize an image. Generally, that's not something that you need to worry too much about. We'll talk about that more later. If you're ever asked to rasterize a photograph, it's not really a big deal. Again, we'll talk about exactly what that means moving forward and how it plays out in Photoshop. So again, raster is how we refer to these pixel-based images, and vector is how we refer to non-pixel-based images, which we saw right here. So vector, again, it just means that I could take these inside of Illustrator, I could scale them up as big as I want, and they would look just as sharp and as detailed, scaled up to 50 feet as they would scaled down to 5 inches. That's why we use Adobe Illustrator. And again, a lot of the tools from Adobe Illustrator are available inside of Photoshop, so we'll get familiar with those. Moving forward, here's some more examples of vector versus raster. All of these logos on the left were created inside Adobe Illustrator, and they were created using vector art. Now again, the one thing you'll notice is that none of these include photographs. These are all things that were created from scratch using text and shapes. Okay? And if you want to learn more about this, of course, MiraCosta has a great Illustrator class. Over here on the right, we have examples of raster images, which again just means pixel-based. And pixel-based basically just means photograph. It started as a photograph. Or in this case, this AI might still have a limited number of pixels. This image right here was maybe created with AI. But over here on the right, you can see this is just a composite created with photographs. And those would be raster images. So asking to rasterize something is basically taking it from being a vector into being a raster. All right, moving forward, how does Photoshop work? What are layers for? Well, hopefully you guys got a good grasp on this in our first assignment, but let's just take a quick look. Here we have an example where we have 3 circles, one white background layer. If we look at our layers over here, we can see there's the white background layer at the bottom. There's the biggest red circle at the bottom layer just above the background. Then we have the blue circle, and then we have the green circle on top. And as you can see, putting the smallest circle on top allows us to see what's beneath it. So we have 4 layers, 3 circles and a background layer. If you turn off the visibility for the background layer, you'll get what's called onion skin. And that basically just means there's opacity. It means that this is see-through. So again, if you ever see this sort of gray and white checkerboard, that is to let you know that there are no pixels there. And if you export this as a PNG, it will retain that opacity. So if I wanted to bring this into a video and lay this over a piece of footage, then you would be able to see the footage behind the circles. But if I export this as a JPEG, it'll automatically fill in any empty space with solid white color. 100% white to be exact. So if you want to maintain opacity, when you go to export, you want to export as a PNG file. If you don't mind it filling this in with solid white, then you can export it as a JPEG. Now in this case, we could always just turn on our background too, and that would ensure that whether we export it as a PNG or a JPEG, if our background is turned on, then we'll have a solid white background. If I move down to the next one, here's just a simple example where we've taken the big red circle and moved it all the way to the top layer. Now obviously the green circle is still there, the blue circle is still there, and their eyeballs are still on. That lets us know that they are visible, but since we have something larger over them, we're not seeing them. So your layer stack here is very important, and it does matter. If you want to see things, you need to understand that if there's something covering it, you won't be able to see it, and that you'll need to move its position in the layer stack or use a blend mode or adjust the opacity of this big red circle. Obviously, if we took the opacity, which is controlled right here on the Layers tab, and we knocked it down to 50%, then we'd be able to see the green and the blue circle, but only 50%, right? We'd still have a half see-through red circle. All right, and the next one. Now here's an example of flattened layers. Notice that basically they've selected all 4 layers and they've right-clicked on them and flattened them into one layer. Now this can be convenient because you're no longer dealing with multiple layers, but the downside is I can't grab that blue circle and nudge it over. I can't click on the red circle and move it over here because this has all been flattened into one image. That basically means that nothing on here is editable. I mean, it is to a certain degree. I could still add color effects and add to this, but I can't grab that blue circle and drag it over here and expect to see the part that is covered up by this green circle because all of our layers have been flattened. Now again, there's times where this makes things easier, makes things more convenient, but at the end of the day, this is destructive. And what that means is that it gives us limited abilities to do further editing. Quite honestly, it gives us almost none because everything is now flattened into one layer. And once you do this, you can't undo it. So don't worry, I'll show you some great techniques to get the benefits of a flattened layer without having to lose the layers that made up the image originally. Now if we come on down here, destructive image adjustment visibility cannot be disabled. Okay, so again, we're just talking about the fact that this image has now been inverted. As you see here, we went to image, adjustment, invert. And if you look at this label, there's no, or this, if you look at this layer, there's no visual invert effect that I could turn on or turn off or delete. Once I use any of these effects, now when I say these effects, what I'm referring to specifically is going up to the top of the Photoshop where it says image, going down to adjustment, and coming over here. And you'll see we have a lot of really cool things we can do. We can adjust the brightness and contrast levels. These are all exposure tools. We can come down to the next group. These are all color tools. We can come down to here and we could add a gradient map. We could posterize the image. We have these effects, but they're all destructive, meaning that with the exception of hitting Command Z, there's no way to get rid of these once you add them. So if the client calls me up and says, hey, we think that maybe we want you to invert the logo. And I say, okay, and I do this, and then come back the next day and they say, oh, we changed our mind, we don't like it. Well, at that point, it's nothing I can do to undo it. But fear not, there is a non-destructive way we can do the exact same thing. And I'll show you that right now. So as you can see up here, it says non-destructive. And to do the same thing in a non-destructive way, we want to use what's called an adjustment layer. Adjustment layers allow you to add effects non-destructively. As we can see right here, we have the original image, and then above it, we have that invert effect. So let me show you where those live so that you can find the non-destructive effects. If we open up Photoshop here, and we'll scale it down to fit the window, and there we go. So notice right now, I'm going to scoot this up just a little bit. We have one photo and we have one layer. Now this photo is a little bit dark. It's a little underexposed. So if I wanted to, say for example, brighten it up a little bit, again, what I was showing you guys earlier is up at the top under the word image, but the adjustment layers, which give you all the same tools, but in a non-destructive format, live right here. Now take a good long look at this icon because we are going to be using it heavily throughout the entire semester. Okay, so you can see right here on your Layers tab, if I pull this off and put it over here, you can see that these options go with it. So this one right here, if I put my mouse over it and I leave it there, it'll say create new fill or adjustment layer. Now again, we used this already in our first assignment, but it's worth talking about again. So when I say add an adjustment layer, the only place you will ever go to find those adjustment layers is at the bottom of your Layers tab in this little circle that is half black and half white. And as you can see here, if I come down here and I click on it, I get all of these options. Again, we have things for color, we have things for exposure, we have things for things we want to create, and then we have some additional effects down here. There's that invert option I showed you. But if I was working on this photo and I wanted to simply brighten it up, I could really use any of these three options right here. The one I prefer to use is levels. And the reason I like that one is because it actually gives me what's called a histogram. And this right over here is basically a representation of the exposure inside this image. And if we just break it down in the most simple terms, on the right is our white value, in the middle is our gray value, and on the left is our black value. And as you can see, everything is shifted towards the blacks. In fact, you'll actually see there's an absence of any highlights over here. And so for that reason, I can tell just by looking at this image that, or by this histogram, that this image is likely underexposed. It's also worth mentioning that anytime I add a adjustment layer and I select it, meaning right now it's unselected, and notice how there's no properties other than for the document. But if I click on the adjustment layer, and I actually want to click right here, I don't want to click on this white box. This white box is what's called a mask, and we'll get into that later. But for now, I just want to click on this icon, and that basically enables the adjustment layer, and you will see that over here in the properties, we get the controls for it. And if I scrub down here, there's a few other options. There's a little slider, some number values I could change. You see that as I move this slider, that's pushing all the information into the black area. If I grab the blacks and I slide this way, it's basically just brightening the entire image, which in this case I don't want to do. Really all I would want to do is probably grab this slider and just slide it over to where the white colors really start to come into play. And you can see there's a little bit of white information down there, but I took it right to kind of where this little ramp starts. And now if we look at this, let's go ahead and scale that image down a little bit. It's looking a whole lot better than it did a second ago. But the coolest thing is that I can turn the eyeball off. If I don't want to use this adjustment layer, I could even grab it and drag it down to the trash, and then it's gone. So the point is simply that at any point, I can come back and adjust this image. So we're going to dig deep into adjustment layers because, again, they're just such a great tool. But at the same time, feel free to experiment with these because there's no wrong answers. You can't mess up your image by adding an adjustment layer. Let's just, for the sake of it, let's grab one more. let's say that I wanted to add a little bit of color to this image, so I came down and I grabbed a photo filter. So as you can see right off the bat, it just stacks it up as another layer. And if I move it out of the way so that I can see the properties, again, you have to make sure it's selected, but as soon as I select it, it brings up the properties. And what a photo filter does essentially is it's kind of there to let you warm up or cool down the image or change the image in some way. As you can see here, it defaulted to the warming filter with a density of 25%. If I just turn this eyeball on and off, you can see there it is without the filter, and there it is with it. It's just adding a little bit of orange to the entire image. And I could play with the density, I could crank it all the way up. Now it's very orange, or I could take it down if I want a little bit less. On top of that, I could click on the color. Actually, you know what? Right now it's set to filter, so I could hit the drop down and I could look at any of these filters. I could use a cooling filter, and that's going to add some blue. Notice I still have the ability to adjust the density. And obviously there's a bunch of other colors in there as well, so feel free to play around with this stuff. If I wanted to pick out my own color, I could switch it from filter to color. And by turning off filter, now it's allowing me to basically use what's called a color picker. And if I double click on this box right here, I can pick any color I want. Let's go to magenta and then crank up the density. And now we're seeing that magenta in my image. So photo filter is great, nice little effect. But the point really that I'm trying to make is how amazingly cool it is that Photoshop lets us add all of this stuff, but at any point we can turn it off if we decide we don't like it. We can drag it down to the garbage can if we decide we're not going to use it or the client doesn't like it, as it is in most cases. So those are adjustment layers. Let's take one last look at that icon right here. It's the circle. Again, a lot of important stuff at the bottom of your layers tab. Garbage can, if you want to delete a layer, drag it to the garbage. There's a little plus button there if you want to add a new empty layer. You can click that button. So if I wanted to come over here and write bug on top of this image, now it's worth mentioning I could click on the original image. I'd have to unlock it by double clicking on it. But I could come down to the original image, grab a brush, and scribble out the words bug. And the reason that I never do that is because it is destructive. Hang on a second. So if I don't know what color I have selected. Let's switch our colors. So if I came down here and moused out the word bug, okay? So as you can see, it's now on that layer. If I turn both these other layers off, so we only have one layer visible, I have just written on top of the photo of the bug. Now, that's generally something I would never do, at least not on purpose. Because once I save this and add a couple more effects, I can't go back and take those words off there. The only way I can get rid of it right now is by hitting Command Z and just Command Zing back a few steps. But if I go up to the new layer, layer number 1, and I select that layer and then write bug over that layer, well now, if I change my mind, I can just turn that layer off. Or maybe I want to grab the selection tool and move the word around or make it smaller, rotate it a little bit, drag it over here, duplicate it, right? Command J, that is the key command to duplicate a layer. I can't do it while it's got the bounding box live, so I'll hit the return key, select that layer, and then hit Command J. And now I've got multiple bugs, even though there's really only one bug. The point is that one of the things that I absolutely love about Photoshop is its flexibility, right? The fact that you can do all of this stuff, and at any point, as long as you do it right and you learn the techniques, you can go back and change it. We can add bugs, we can take them away, we can duplicate them, we can do all that stuff. Okay. Well, I mentioned the difference between JPEGs and PNGs. We'll talk about that in a second. But what I want to talk about right now is the difference between a PSD and a JPEG or PNG. So when you are doing work, like I was there with my, whoops, didn't mean to move that. Like I was there with Photoshop. If I hit Command S to save, or Shift Command S to save as, that's saving my Photoshop document, my PSD file. But if I choose File Export or File Save for Web, those are going to allow me to then export JPEGs or PNGs, which are smaller compressed files. Now with a PSD, you're going to see all of your layers, all of your effects, and it's going to be a big file. That's something like that I would never send to a client. I only want them to see my final work. If they have things they'd like me to change, that's fine. I'll take their notes, I'll come back and open up the PSD and I'll make those changes. Because the Photoshop document has all of the layers. And if you, again, hit the File drop-down and go to Save, it's going to save it as a PSD. But if you go down to where it says Export, and then you choose Export As, that's going to bring up basically what we call a compression window or an export window that allows you to save a compressed version. Now, compression generally tries to maintain the quality without the huge file size. So for example, if I choose File, Export, and then hit the little triangle and go to Export As, it's going to open up this window. And in this window, I can resize the image, because you saw earlier that photo of the bug was 8,000 by 5,000 pixels. I can pretty confidently say I would never need to post an image that big to the internet. So generally, I would prefer to cut it down to maybe, 1,000 by 2,000 or 2,500 by 1,200. The point is, in the Export As window, you can do all of that. You can also go up to the quality slider and lower the quality. So if I'm just sending this as an information image to somebody who just needs to see it, but they don't need to see a super detailed version, or if I'm trying to save space on a hard drive and I just want to have a very small, low quality version, I can create that in Export As. But if I keep the quality, up around 6 or 7, the image is going to look fine. It's not going to look bad. And then I can hit Export. So at that point, if I were to export a JPEG or a PNG, then I would still have the PSD file with all of the layers, but that would also then have a JPEG file that is a flattened version that I could then email to a friend, upload to Instagram, or whatever. I hope that makes sense. We'll talk about this a lot throughout the semester. Now, again, with your PSD, you want to save your work pretty regularly. And you can do that by just hitting Command S anytime you want to. If you want to save it and give it a new title and save it to a new location, then you might want to choose Save As, because that's going to give you the opportunity to pick a drive to save it to and change the title if you want to. So, main file formats. We have high resolution. These are the ones, again, high quality. Low or no compression, meaning we're not stripping away color information for the sake of a smaller size. So number 1, your PSD. This is a large file that supports layers, effects, and everything you can do inside of Photoshop. But it's not the type of file you want to save or post to the web because it's a working file. It's a place where you choose to do your work. Now, I prefer not to share these with clients as they are my work. Though at a job, I might often share them with other designers. For this reason and your own sanity, they need to be kept organized and they need to have layers that are labeled. When I save my work in Photoshop, I hit Command S. I'm essentially saving the changes to that PSD file. Now, a TIFF is a file that's high res with no layers. Now, you can have TIFFs that do have layers, but basically a TIFF is a flattened PSD where there's no compression. Okay, so there's no loss of quality. Even when you save a JPEG at high quality, you are losing some quality. So when you need to share work with a client, TIFFs are good to use as they give the best quality while only showing the client the finished product. Also, if you're making pages for a book, for example, you'd want to save your work as a TIFF, because when you export the book itself, in InDesign or software like that, it's going to compress those images. So high resolution, no compression, generally a PSD or a TIFF file. And again, I kind of went through this, so I'll make this brief, but if it's going to the web, if it's going to, just about anything, I tend to use JPEGs. They're low resolution files that we export out of Photoshop for the purpose of sharing, posting online, and other situations where you need to share an image with someone and it generally needs to be sent online. Now, a PNG, which stands for Portable Network Graphic, is very similar to a JPEG. The only difference is a PNG supports opacity. Now, just a couple more things and then we will finish up this video. Important! You will almost never turn in your PSDs in this class. They're too big and they can't be opened outside of Photoshop. So unless I ask for a PSD specifically, you will not turn them in. As you can see right here, there's two examples of the 3 circles. If you look at the JPEG, it's 40 kilobytes. If you look at the 3 circles PSD, it's 200 kilobytes. So it's 5 times larger. That's what I'm talking about when I say compression. A JPEG is a compressed version of the Photoshop doc, and while it still maintains almost all the visual quality, it has a much more manageable file size. All right, just a couple more here. Now, I wanted to just get a couple terms out of the way. The first one is tint. So we're looking at some color here, and what we're about to talk about is going to cover color and exposure. So right in the middle here, we have the color red. Adding white to that color is tinting the color white. So if someone says, hey, tint that color, you know they should be meaning add white to that color. So tinting, despite the fact that you might think, well, if I tint the windows on my car, they're going to make them darker, right? Well, yeah, but that's an inaccurate use of the word tint. The right way is if you add shade. If you shade the color red, then you are adding black to that color. So everything in between red and black are shades of red. Everything between white and red are tints of red or white, depending on where you start, I suppose. The point is simply, if you make a color darker, you're shading it. If you make a color lighter, by adding white, you are tinting it. Now we have a tonal range. What is a tonal range? Well, this kind of refers to that image that I showed you when I added the levels filter, the histogram. While this is sort of backwards compared to what you'll find in Photoshop. Usually the blacks are going to be on the left and the whites will be on the right, or the highlights and the midtones will be in the middle. But basically shadows, your shadow point is where the darkest pixels begin. Now, why this is so important is because if anything goes past the darkest color, it's essentially referred to as clipping, meaning that you've lost detail because it's so dark, there's no visible detail left. On the white side, we'd call it blown out. When something is so white that it's lost the detail, you've blown it out. So that's why you want to refer back to a histogram whenever possible to find out where your tone is exactly. It's a good way to kind of not have to rely on just eyeballing everything. So your highlight point is where your lightest pixels begin. Your shadow point is where your darkest pixels begin. Your midtones are right in the center. And again, we'll talk about this a lot as we go through this class. And then finally, let's just talk about hue, saturation, and brightness. So hue is the pure or actual color based on the wavelength of light. So a hue is essentially, hey, I'm using a hue of red. Okay, saturation is the measure of purity of the color. It also measures its intensity, vibrancy, or brilliance. So in this case, you see that basically we're going from what we call middle gray, or kind of right in the middle of that tonal range, up to red. And the more gray we add, or the more red we remove, the more it appears to be desaturated. And again, less vibrant, less brilliance. So if I looked at an image and the reds were sort of this color right here, I might say those reds look desaturated. Or maybe those reds need to be a little more vibrant, which would just mean remove the gray and add more of the actual color. And then finally, our brightness value, also called value or luminance. And this is the amount of light or dark, or the shade or tint of a color. If I add black to my red, I am shading it and making it darker. If I add white to my red, I am tinting it and making it lighter. In this case, adding white's going to make it brighter. Adding black is going to make it darker. So the reason that I bring this up is because we have filters inside of Photoshop that handle things like hue, saturation, and brightness. Let me show you. Let's come over to our photo here. Let's go down to our adjustment layers right here. And let's go to hue, saturation. And look what we're going to find. We're going to find a filter or an adjustment layer that allows us to adjust hue, saturation, and in this case it calls it lightness, but I think that's essentially the same as brightness. So as you can see, if I grab the hue slider and I start to take things to the left, you can see it's now adding green to my colors, and when it adds that green I end up with a magenta because it's blending it with the existing orange. If I take it over here, you can see it's now shifting things towards the green because I'm adding blue. I'm basically adding this color to the existing color. And if we just turn this off real quick, you can see there's a lot of orange in there, right? All those little points are orange, all the highlights are orange. So if I add blue to those, blue and orange, it's going to give me green. So that's what hue does. As you see, I can drag this around. Saturation, pretty much exactly what you'd imagine. If I take it all the way to the left, I get a black and white photo. If I take it all the way to the right, I get probably what looks like a nuclear explosion. This is generally what we call frying an image, oversaturating the colors to the point that it kind of gets this nuclear looking effect. So sometimes I might pop the saturation just a little bit, but I very rarely crank it up all that much unless I need to. And then lightness is just going to basically add exposure and tint the whole image lighter, or darkness is going to, well, you guessed it, make the image darker. Now the cool thing about hue saturation filters is that you can actually target specific colors. Right now you can see it's set to master. That means it's affecting everything. But if I hit this drop down, let's say I just want to affect the greens. I can select that, and now it's only going to affect these green colors right in here. This is called a range selector. And this is just letting me know what it is selected when I chose the green option. Now, as you can see here, we have actually sliders that would allow me to make this selection bigger or smaller depending on how much of this image I want to affect. But let's go ahead and just go over to hue, and let's change our hue to something pretty drastic like, I don't know, red. So as you can see, it's adding red with the greens, and we're getting this purple. If I turn this off, you can see it's turning our leaves purple. But you can see it's not affecting everything. It's only affecting the green colors. And you're looking at this and you're saying, but I can see green right there. Well, that green is just outside of our range. If I want to include that green right there, I can just grab these little stops and widen them out. And you can see now it's getting a little more of that. Let's go ahead and take this even further. See if we can't get all of that green. And there you go. By increasing the range of greens selected, I can affect more of those greens with my hue saturation slider. And just like every adjustment layer, if I decide I don't like it, I can turn it off. Or maybe I think it's a little bit too strong, but I want to keep it. I could go up to opacity for this adjustment layer and basically just weaken the adjustment layer by dropping it down to 50%. And now I get this weird gray color in here. Or I could use a blend mode and I could blend this layer in with the photo below it. And that's going to give me some interesting choices like darken or lighten or overlay. It gives me a bunch of contrast or difference. It usually gives you something pretty weird. Or maybe just color. And that sticks to kind of just that blue color. All right, guys. So again, that was just some topics I wanted to cover. Give you guys a little pep talk. Let you know that if this is challenging, that's okay. It's going to get easier. So stick with it. If you run into problems, let me know. And we'll just keep charging ahead. And by the end, you'll look back at these first lessons and you'll laugh at how challenging it was, because in about 7 weeks, you guys are all going to be pretty good at this. So that'll do it.